If you're so bored, you should get a hobby, Brittany said, shoving the dog's leashes into my hands as she brushed past me and walked straight into my own house. The words landed in my chest like a small, cold stone. Bored, as if my life had narrowed down to waiting by the door for her to decide what I should do with it. I forced a smile, because that was easier than letting her see how much it hurt, and told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I'd been telling myself that for years. They were early for Sunday dinner again, which meant the roast was still in the oven and I was still in my old sweater, hair pinned up. Mike went straight to the fridge without saying hello, opened it like it belonged to him, and grabbed a soda. "You really should stop buying this brand, Mom," he said after the first sip. "It's not good for you at your age." At my age, the words were gentle on the surface, but I heard the edge underneath. Too old, too slow, too fragile. I nodded, even though it was my money, my fridge, my one small indulgence. His casual criticism scraped at something inside me that had been raw for a long time. I felt the resentment rise, hot, then quickly tamped down, the way you lower a burner just before something boils over. Brittany clicked across the kitchen tile in her boots, surveying the room with that half smile she wore when she was judging something. "It still smells like Robert's cologne in here," she said, wrinkling her nose. "You really should update this place, Anne. It's like a time capsule." She said my name instead of Mom, like she always did, and it landed the same way every time, a reminder that I was tolerated, never fully welcomed. A time capsule. To her, it was old furniture and faded paint. To me, it was the life I'd built with my husband, the last place where I felt like more than background support. Her tone flattened all of that into something faintly embarrassing. I smiled again, my face tight, and said I liked it cozy. What I wanted to say was that not everything needs replacing the moment it stops shining. "Did you remember the puppy's treats?" she asked, dropping her purse onto my kitchen chair like it belonged there. "They really like that grain-free kind. It's a little pricey, but they're our babies." She glanced at me, waiting. Of course I'd bought them. I'd picked them up on sale, even though my hip had been aching badly that week, and standing in line felt like balancing on nails. "Yes," I said, "they're in the pantry." I didn't mention that I'd put my favorite cereal back on the shelf to afford them. I didn't say I'd skipped the pain cream this month because the copay felt indulgent. Every time she called the dogs our babies, it felt like a quiet jab about the grandchildren I never saw as much as I'd hoped. Mike leaned against the doorway, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, Mom, about that thing with the car insurance," he said, not looking up. "The bill came in higher than we expected. We're a little tight this month. Think you could spot us again? Just until my bonus hits." Again, that word stung more than the request itself. Again, like all the other small emergencies, the broken dishwasher, the surprise tax bill, the school fees. Each time, I'd opened my checkbook with a slightly shaky hand and told myself I was helping my son build a better life. Now his voice was casual, as if I were a line item in their budget, not a person making quiet sacrifices. Resentment curled in my stomach, thick and heavy, as I nodded and said I'd see what I could do. "Oh, don't act like it's a big deal," Brittany added, already unlocking her phone. "You're comfortable, Anne. The house is paid off and you don't have anyone to take care of. We're the ones juggling everything." She laughed lightly, like it was a joke, but her eyes stayed sharp. No one to take care of. She had no idea how deeply those words cut. As if the meals I cooked, the dogs I watched, the rides I gave, and the checks I wrote were invisible. As if the empty chair where my husband used to sit meant my life was somehow easier instead of lonelier. Every time she called me comfortable, it felt like erasing the years I'd worked, the care I took with every dollar, the nights I lay awake worrying about medical bills. I set the table while they scrolled on their phones, trading memes and weekend plans that didn't include me. When I asked how their week had been, Brittany shrugged. "Busy, you know how it is. We barely have time to breathe." She didn't ask about mine, she never did. The 2 days I'd spent icing my hip after hauling their groceries up my own front steps wouldn't have fit into her definition of busy anyway. As I laid out the plates and folded the napkins, every small slight, every remark about my age, every assumption that my time and money were theirs, stacked inside me like heavy dishes in the sink. I felt the resentment building, quiet and dense, pressing against my ribs. They saw me as useful, not valuable. present, but not worth listening to. And still, I basted the roast, refilled their glasses, smiled at their stories about friends in Clark's Summit, and pretended not to notice that I was only ever asked to give, never invited to be truly seen. The first time I saw Brittany at that ATM, I almost walked past without a second thought. She stood there in her tan coat, head slightly tilted, tapping the screen the way someone does when they've done it 100 times before. For a moment, I was simply surprised to see her in my part of town. Then I noticed the logo on the machine and my stomach tightened. That was my bank, my branch, my account. She had never once asked where I did my banking, never cared about the details of my life. Seeing her there felt wrong, like finding someone sitting in my chair without asking. I stayed on the sidewalk, half hidden behind a small tree, and watched her take the cash. She didn't rush. She didn't look nervous. That calmness hurt more than anything else. If she'd hesitated, even for a second, I might have convinced myself there was some mistake. But she moved with easy confidence, and it made me feel foolish. I thought of all the times she'd sighed and said they were stretched thin, the way her voice always nudged me toward my checkbook. Now I watched her pull money from a machine tied to my bank, and the resentment I'd kept buried for years began to rise. Everywhere struggling, Anne replayed in my head, no longer sounding like a plea but a trick. I went home with the image burned into me. Her tan coat, her boots, the small smile as she folded the bills into her wallet. I told myself it had to be another account, another card, something ordinary, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It sat heavy in my chest while I made tea, while I tried to read, while my hip throbbed from the walk. I kept thinking about the card I'd given Mike years ago, when he'd called about a flat tire and said he was short on cash. Only for emergencies, I'd told him carefully, hoping he understood how serious I was. Remembering that now, heat rushed to my face. I realized my idea of an emergency and theirs might not match at all. The next morning, I went to the First Keystone Bank branch downtown. My hands shook slightly as I signed my name and asked the teller to see my recent statements. My voice sounded small, overly polite. "Take your time," she said kindly. The words stung because no one at home ever told me that. Mike and Brittany always made me feel slow in the way. Sitting in that quiet bank, I suddenly felt the weight of all the times they'd talked over me. When the young woman returned with the papers and set them in front of me, I thanked her and began scanning the list. The first $2,500 withdrawal barely registered. My mind tried to skip past it. I told myself it had to be a mistake. By the third one, my throat tightened. By the 10th, I had to press my hand flat against the desk to steady myself. Each line matched a day I remembered clearly. Book club, a doctor's appointment, grocery shopping, ordinary days, days when I was nowhere near an ATM. Every entry felt like a small betrayal spelled out in black and white. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" the teller asked gently. Her kindness sharpened the resentment. My own family had taken my money without asking. A stranger was the one checking if I was all right. "I didn't make these withdrawals," I said. Hearing the words out loud made my heart race. Saying them turned suspicion into fact. Anger pushed through the shock as I stared at the total, $25,000 gone. Brittany's voice echoed in my head. "You're comfortable, Anne. You're fine. Comfortable. Fine." They had decided my pain, my surgery fund, were just numbers they could move around. The manager joined us and offered to review the ATM footage. As he spoke in his calm, professional tone, I thought of every time Brittany had laughed and called me lucky for owning my house outright. Every time Mike had said, "You don't need much, Mom." I'd smiled back then, trying to feel grateful. Now those words sounded rehearsed, like a way to make me feel guilty for having anything at all. When they confirmed there was footage of someone using my card, and I heard myself describe Brittany's coat and boots, the resentment settled into something solid. Not loud, not wild, just clear, cold, an understanding that the people I loved had treated my trust like a tool. I gathered the printed statements and slid them into a folder. Each page felt like another small piece of my old life breaking away, and at the same time, the quiet formation of someone new. Christmas Eve used to be my favorite day of the year. When Mike was little, he would tear through this same kitchen in fuzzy socks, begging to open just one present early. I kept thinking about that as I smoothed the red tablecloth and set out the plates, my hands moving on habit while my mind replayed the bank footage and the numbers on those statements. The folder sat on the counter, closed but heavy in my thoughts. I had already decided. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't cry. I would tell the truth and see what they chose to do with it. The doorbell rang earlier than we'd agreed, like it always did. Brittany came in first, wrapped in expensive perfume, her boots still dusted with snow. "Oh, you went all out," she said, glancing around the dining room. Her tone sounded impressed, but her eyes had already moved to the food. "You really shouldn't tire yourself out like this, Anne. It's too much for you." Too much for you. The concern carried judgment underneath. She never refused the meal, never offered more than a store-bought cake, but she always reminded me that, in her mind, I belonged on a sofa, quiet, careful, out of the way. Resentment stirred, small and sharp. I swallowed it and said I enjoyed cooking. Mike followed with his usual half hug, one arm already pulling away. "Smells great, Mom," he said, then added, "I hope you didn't blow your whole check on this. You've got to think long-term." The irony nearly made me laugh. Long-term. From the man who had taken $25,000 out of my account without a word. Instead, I nodded and felt my chest tighten. Dinner began almost normally. We passed dishes. They scrolled through their phones between bites. I asked polite questions about work and friends. They answered briefly, then turned back to each other. Every time they did, I felt like a background extra in my own home. I watched Mike cut into the ham I'd basted all afternoon and remembered the year I worked double shifts at the school office just to afford the tiny bike he'd begged for. Back then, he'd hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. Now he barely looked at me. Halfway through the meal, while they were talking about a possible trip with friends, I stood and went to the counter. My hands weren't steady, but I picked up the folder and carried it back. I set it down between the serving dishes. "There's something I need to talk to you about," I said. Brittany's eyes narrowed slightly. "Can it wait?" she asked. "We were just saying how we never get a peaceful dinner." Peaceful. To them, that meant me staying quiet, never asking where my money went, never admitting I was hurt. I opened the folder and spread the statements across the table. "These are my bank records," I said. "There are withdrawals here that I didn't make." Mike glanced down, then leaned back in his chair. "Mom, what is this?" he said flatly. "You're confused. You probably forgot." Confused. Forgot. The same tone he used when I mixed up the name of a TV show. Hearing it now, with $25,000 in front of us, felt like a slap dressed up as kindness. "I know exactly where I was on these days," I said, tapping the dates. "Book club, doctor's appointments. I was nowhere near an ATM." My voice shook, but the facts didn't. Brittany picked up a page, skimmed it, then set it down with a shrug. "You gave Mike a card once, remember? Years ago. Maybe this is just that. We were borrowing. You said we could use it for emergencies." Borrowing, emergencies. She said it like I'd agreed to all of it. I thought of my aching hip, the surgery costs, the nights I kept the heat low to save money. 12 withdrawals, I said quietly. The same amount, while I was figuring out how to pay for my surgery. For a second, something flickered across Mike's face. Guilt, maybe fear. Then his jaw hardened. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said. "You sit in a paid-off house. We're trying to build a life. You had it easier than we do. You owe us some help." That was when something shifted inside me. I remembered working 2 jobs when he was a boy, coming home exhausted and still making dinner, still checking homework, going without new clothes so he could have a yearbook, skipping vacations so he could take school trips. Easier. The unfairness hit so hard I had to grip the edge of the table. "I have helped," I said, "with your down payment, your bills, your dogs, your food. I never asked to be repaid, but this money was for my health. You took it without asking." Brittany leaned back, crossed her arms, and smiled coldly. "You'll be fine, Anne. You always are, and we're your family. Who else are you going to spend it on?" Her voice was light, but the message was brutal. "You have no one else, so everything you have belongs to us." Years of resentment finally spilled over. I felt my hand grab the empty glass before my mind caught up. I stood, heart pounding, and hurled it at the cabinet. It shattered against the door, the sound sharp and sudden in the small kitchen. Mike jumped to his feet. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted. "You're acting crazy." He stepped toward me, face tight with anger. "After everything we do for you, you lose it over money?" Everything they do for me. As if my life hadn't been one long act of giving. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, his hands were on my shoulders, shoving me back. I stumbled, my foot catching on the rug, and the floor rushed up to meet me. Pain exploded at the back of my head, my body ringing from the impact. Above me, I heard Brittany's sharp voice telling him they needed to leave, now. The front door slammed moments later, and the house I had filled with warmth, food, and effort fell silent, broken only by my own uneven breathing. In the courthouse hallway, everything felt too sharp, the floors too shiny, the lights too bright. I kept thinking how strange it was that my life with Mike and Brittany had led here, not to a holiday or a family dinner, but to a room where strangers would decide what was fair. I sat on a hard bench outside the courtroom, hands folded over my purse, while Erica reviewed her notes one last time. When the door opened and Mike and Brittany walked in with their lawyer, the resentment I'd been trying to keep neat and contained stirred again. Brittany saw me first. She looked me up and down quickly, then leaned toward their lawyer and whispered something. He nodded and patted her arm, as if she were the one who needed comfort. That small gesture irritated me more than I expected. For years, she had treated me like I was fragile and foolish, too old to understand how things worked. Now she was being handled delicately, and I was the one holding myself together. Mike wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the floor, jaw clenched, hands shoved into his pockets like a teenager waiting outside the principal's office. That avoidance hurt more than yelling ever could have. He could take my money, shove me in my own kitchen, call me selfish when I finally said no, but he couldn't look at me when other people were watching. Love and anger twisted together inside me. He was still my son, but I was finally seeing him clearly. Inside the courtroom, their lawyer stood and began talking about misunderstandings and family support gone wrong. Each word scraped at my nerves. Misunderstanding, as if that single word could erase deliberate withdrawals, months of silence, the shove that sent me to the floor. When he said, "My clients never intended harm," I pressed my hands together to keep myself still. If that night had involved a stranger, no one would have softened the language. Because it was my son and his wife, there was a quiet push to make it smaller, kinder, easier to excuse. When it was my turn, I told the truth. I spoke about the ATM footage, the $25,000, the way my son said I owed him because I was comfortable, the way Brittany told me I would die alone in my house. Saying the words again tightened my chest, but it also steadied me. Those phrases had been used to silence me, to keep me ashamed for wanting basic respect. Spoken out loud in that room, they revealed exactly what they were. At one point, Mike finally spoke. "She's my mom," he said, his voice tight. "I thought she wanted to help. I thought that's what family does." The way he twisted it made my stomach turn. He still framed it as my failure, as if my role as a mother had no limits, no right to end. Brittany dabbed at her eyes while she talked about stress and pressure, but she never once said she was wrong. Every half apology drifted across the room like cold air. Instead of softening me, it settled my resentment into something solid. I could finally see their words for what they were, tools to avoid responsibility. When the judge delivered the verdict, guilty, repayment with interest, probation, I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. Quiet, grounding relief, like someone had finally confirmed that I hadn't imagined any of it. As we left, Brittany brushed past me without a word. Mike looked at me for half a second, his eyes filled with anger and something like disbelief, then turned away. Even then, neither of them said, "I'm sorry." That silence told me everything. The months that followed were slow and strange. Through Erica and Detective Ramirez, I heard that the house in Clark Summit went into foreclosure, that they'd moved into a small rental, that the strain between them was heavy. A part of me, the old part, wanted to show up with a check and a casserole. Every time that urge rose, I remembered the kitchen floor, the bank statements, the way they spoke to me when they still believed I'd forgive anything. The memory cooled the urge into a simple truth. They made their choices. I had my hip surgery at St. Luke's. A nurse named Lila came by for a while to help me move and do my exercises. She spoke to me like I mattered, not like a task to manage. One afternoon, while she watered my new tomato plants, she said, "You know, you're tougher than you look." I laughed, but inside, that simple respect felt like healing. I went back to book club at the Scranton Public Library. I signed up for a painting class at the senior center. I met friends at Cole Street Coffee and learned how to enjoy slow mornings without waiting for my phone to buzz with another request. Sometimes people asked if I missed Mike. The truth was yes. I missed the boy he used to be, but I didn't miss the man who saw my love as a bottomless account. They tried to reach me for a while, block numbers, messages passed through relatives. She's really going to cut off her only child? One text read. Even secondhand, it stung. It carried the same old message. I should accept anything just to keep my place. I stayed firm. I kept the restraining order. I chose my peace over their expectations. Now, when I sit in my small backyard with a cup of coffee and feel my new hip doing what it's meant to do, I think about that night in my kitchen and the long road that followed. I'm alone more often than I expected to be at this age, but I'm not empty. I have my garden, my stories, my own name on my own accounts, and people who see me as more than a source of help. And if someone listening to this has ever been told they owe their comfort, their savings, or their peace just to keep a place in their own family, I hope they hear what it took me 72 years to learn. The day you finally choose yourself is the day the story truly begins to change.